panel on the future of Arctic science and science diplomacy. My name is Ole Øvretveit, and I'm working as a project manager for Academia Europaea on a project to investigate the status of these questions. Academia Europaea is arranging this event in collaboration with UiT, the Arctic University, the University of Bergen, the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters, and the Norwegian Polar Institute. And before we move on, I would like to thank the Arctic Frontiers for letting us have this panel on the conference, and also extend my congratulations to Anne Fredriksson and her team on an outstanding conference. Russia's invasion has sent shockwaves throughout the world. An already strained relationship between Russia and the West has entered an ice-cold phase. The Arctic has been a region of collaboration and peaceful coexistence for decades. Massive political, industrial, and economic resources have been deployed into people-to-people and science collaboration projects across borders in the Arctic. And looking at the jungle of Arctic collaboration today, at least until recently, it all seemed inevitable that all these projects of collaboration that we have in the Arctic had to come into existence. But I don't think that it had to become, the Arctic had to become this region of collaboration that we have become used to thinking of it as. A combination of several elements in the formative years in and around the end of the Cold War was in place to facilitate collaboration and peaceful coexistence. Of course, the Gorbachev's Murmansk speech was pivotal, along with the growing understanding of long-transported toxins among scientists and their effects across borders in the Arctic. A growing knowledge of the climate change and the Arctic's role in understanding it. Some Arctic countries wanted a closer collaboration and institutional framework, others didn't. But those who did gave nutrition to some science diplomacy entrepreneurs who started laying a foundation to build further collaboration upon. And of course, from '96, the establishment of the Arctic Council, things took off, and even more so in the following decade with the enormous resource estimates that was presented. And in these 20, 30 years, institutions have been built, MOUs have been signed, projects have been made, and friendship and personal connections have been established across borders. In 2014, the Russian invasion of Crimea, things got more complicated. But still in this period, there was a will to keep the Arctic collaboration going, and on some areas even growing. This stopped with the attack on the Ukraine about a year ago. Institutional, political, economic, scientific collaboration is now frozen. And of course, this has large consequences for the Arctic. The pausing of Arctic Council activities, numerous people-to-people initiative business projects have been stopped. Western countries have decided to suspend all science collaboration with Russian partners. Scientist-to-scientist collaboration is still open and functional, or not really functional, but because on both sides the incentives to collaborate are not strong. Slowly, networks and personal friendships erode, and restarting collaboration gets more difficult. As we all know, the Arctic has been described as the thermometer of the world's climate. Knowledge from this part of the world gives scientists important information about the general development of the world's climate. Without collaboration with Russian scientists and access to Russian territory, both terrestrial and offshore, data becomes incomplete and lose value. This makes a potential crisis behind the crisis that the war has created. It's important to make clear that this event is not seeking to criticize the Western government sanctioning sanctioning in principle. Aggressive states going to war should be penalized anywhere, not least here in our own neighborhood. But still, there have been strong voices questioning the sanctioning against science collaboration and the procedures for making these decisions. Like the International Science Council calling for more involvement from the science community in the process leading to the political decisions. And then again, on the other side, there are those calling for stronger sanctions. Another argument that has been made is that there are collaborating structures which has not been frozen, like search and rescue, oil spill and nuclear observation, and of course the Russian-Norwegian fisheries collaboration. And these are all vital in their way, but one could make the argument that the understanding of climate is as, if not more, important. So we will dig further into these questions here this morning and discuss the status and future of the Arctic science, be it science diplomacy, science collaboration, or knowledge-based management. To me, the big question is whether Arctic science collaboration is frozen or broken. Most likely, the answer to the question lies in how long it takes to get back to some sort of collaborative stage or some sort of post-Cold War normality. If it takes too long, the road back might be too complicated. And all the elements might not be in place to recreate or revitalize it. But then again, these are the questions that we are here to get closer to the answer to. The UiT, the Arctic University of Norway, is a pillar in Arctic science collaboration. 50 years ago, or 55 years ago to be exact, it was established to secure the northern part of Norway had medical doctors. In 2021, they served their mission right by hiring their new rector. Rune Olsen is a professor of medical physics, and before he came to the Arctic capital, he served as dean and later rector at the University of Bergen. It's also worth mentioning that in 2021 he was presented with the President Merit Award by the Academia Europaea. Rector, the floor is yours.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It is a true pleasure for me to be here and talk about matters that I think are of utmost importance, and in particular in these days. I think it's always been like that in addition to the ordinary or the conventional diplomacy, the science diplomacy has, it has been a valuable add-on to the conventional diplomacy. And the reason is we can find in the way scientists actually collaborate. Science is about, to a large extent, to collaborate across borders in the endeavor of seeking new insights. So we have to talk to each other. And that, of course, creates networks, links, dialogues. And that is, to a large extent, what diplomacy is all about. So, in conventional times, in normal times, the science diplomacy has been of value in addition to the conventional diplomatic dialogues and diplomacy. In troubled times, when the conventional diplomacy struggles, we have always could have relied on science diplomacy. That is the dialogue between scientists across borders, the collaboration of Arctic research, over climate research, etc. Not so these days when it comes to Russia. Russia is or represents 40–50% of Arctic. So it's a substantial, big, important Arctic nation. And if we look at the climate change that happens on this globe and look at the map, the heat map of the globe, we see that, well, it is in the Arctic. There we see the highest change in temperature. And also one of the regions where we see the most severe consequences of the climate change. We are not able these days to collaborate with our Russian colleagues to maintain the highly important research collaboration over pressing issues, namely the climate change taking place in the Arctic, with the consequences for ecosystems and in the long run for sustainable livelihood and societies. I don't foresee that we can maintain or retain or come back to a normal situation for the foreseeable future. So how do we manage this then? Well, it's not possible to have data from Russia these days. So we struggle. We need to find different ways of trying to understand the circumpolar, the Arctic global, changes in the climate that we see in this region. And then, of course, we have to try to substitute as best as we can with collaboration with other partners, circumpolar, even though we will still lack 40% of the land mass in the Arctic. So it has severe consequences for understanding the climate change and the consequences of the climate change. Our university have had for quite some years approximately 250, 270 agreements between us and international research institutions, universities. 50 of them, approximately, was with Russian universities. A huge portion of our international collaboration sort of disappeared when the day Russia invaded Ukraine. So for us, it has had a huge impact on the dialogue between some of the most prominent collaborators we've had. Even though we cannot collaborate with Russian colleagues today, it is still important for a university as ours to be able to understand, to build up competence with respect to Russia, understand culture, languages, politics, businesses that is actually going on, in order to provide also insight to governmental authorities. Because I think there is a clear link between science advice and science diplomacy. And as a comprehensive university, it is like that, as I see it. We are able to address grand societal challenges that are by nature complex. And by bringing a number of disciplines in from a comprehensive university, we can contribute with knowledge that is holistic in a way. And that is the best possible way we can actually provide advice also to policymakers, authorities. So I think the role of a comprehensive university is not only in understanding the new geopolitical situation, but also the climate change in the Arctic, consequences for ecosystem and sustainable livelihoods and societies is utmost importance. Lastly, I'd like to say that as an Arctic university, northernmost university on this globe, it's also important for us to provide knowledge, insight, to politicians, to policymakers also outside our own country, like EU. EU has launched a strategy for the Arctic. It is a very good strategy for the environment, the climate, etc. But we also need to see to it that also the fact that there are living people in the Arctic, in the high north. We are here to develop sustainable societies. We are here to also develop the Arctic for people, for climate and environment. And we can only do that if we jointly, if we join forces and use the comprehensive knowledge that we have when it comes to the Arctic, also in a science diplomacy, in a science advice setting. Thank you.
Thank you, Dag Rune. Our next speaker is the president of the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters since 2022. She was the scientific director for the University of Bergen's strategic SDG initiative, Ocean Sustainability Bergen, from 2019 to 2021. She holds a PhD in microbial ecology from the University of Bergen, where she since 2007 has been professor of geomicrobiology. She also holds an associate professor position at the University Center at Svalbard. Lise Øvreås, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ole, and thanks for inviting me to this event. So I was planning of looking into my kind of two positions, how I'm working into the Arctic and also into the science advice. If I first start, so I've been the elected president of the Academy for 1 year, and just after a month in the chair, it was the Ukrainian war. And the Academy, what we're supposed to do is to have a platform for meeting, an open meeting, and to present the latest science and have a debate place. And then we are handing out scientific prizes. So we're looking into science excellency. So we're handing out the Vista Prize, the Kavli Prize, and the Abel Prize. And we also have geared up on science advice mechanisms. So we have a very nice facility house in Oslo, in Drammensveien, and we are the neighbor of the Russian embassy, which meaning that it has been a bit challenging to kind of have the open meeting next to the Russian embassy. And that's why we also decided to put up the Ukrainian flag to kind of show that we have the support with Ukraine's. So, but of course, it was the Ukrainian war made everything difficult, and as science or international collaboration with scientists is supposed to be non-political, but it has really shown to be very difficult. Of course, we have been supporting with our academy that we feel that the threats of the democracy is shouldn't happen in 2020, and that we support the Ukrainian scientists and the Ukrainian people. But that also makes it quite difficult to invite them on board in our meeting arena, etc. So we also join forces with all the European academies, also to have kind of all these statements. And so that's another, we are part of all these European arrangement academies, and everybody is kind of supporting this. But it is difficult because it's both kind of resistance from the Norwegian or the international scientists and also the Russian scientists. So it is even though the government say you can have one-to-one collaboration, it is a challenge. But we're trying to work international. This International Union of Academies was actually established in 1919 after the First World War to kind of have a mechanisms to still be able to work and to build up the academia on this. So being kind of in this setting, it is very challenging time, and that where we have really had open borders and open doors, it is now challenging. So Ole was also mentioning that I have a professorship at UNES, and I've been working with permafrost and climate change for 20 years and really seen the changes in the Arctic. And this is to remind you that the dark purple color is showing the permafrost area in the Arctic, which is a huge area that is covered by permafrost. And if you also look at this map, you can see that 50% of the permafrost area are in Russia, meaning that we are now, with not being in dialogue, we are missing 50% of the data of what is going on there. So again, we have been working a lot with permafrost drilling. All the work that I've been doing has been in Svalbard, where we usually also had a very close collaboration with scientists, with Russian scientists, but now we are again missing a lot of data, because we see that it's the permafrost, the thawing of permafrost is really dramatic. It's happening now, and it's big changes going on, and we have better technology now, so we can go deeper and deeper into these areas. And what we see is that you have the permafrost thawing going deeper, more release of methane gases, and also you have more different mechanisms in the permafrost. So we also have been looking into pingo systems, that is groundwater coming up, making these cones, and we see more and more gas coming out of the ground, and that is making, we need new models, we need new budgets, and this is just to show the latest data. We have the circles. This is around Nordensjøland at Svalbard. So you see all these bubbles, that's methane popping up of the ground. And this is really new data, and we are stunned by all this methane coming out of the ground. The numbers are much higher than we have anticipated from before, and we really see that this is data that should be combined with those we used to collaborate with, the Russian scientists. So this is also a very challenge to being a single or a small research group and not have the whole community to collaborate with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lise. Coming up next is the director of the Norwegian Polar Institute since 2017. Ole Øvretveit has previously been the managing director at National Institute of Nutrition and Seafood Research and the Norwegian University Center in Svalbard. He worked for a number of years also at the Institute of Marine Research, where he was, among other things, director of research from 2000 to 2012. Misund holds a PhD in fisheries biology from the University of Bergen. Ole Øvretveit, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ole, and quite a pleasure to be here to speak to you about these changes in the world that are affecting us all. This morning we heard about the bombing of Krematorsk and a lot of people missing there, and the war is affecting us all, and we hear about it every day. We hear about it in the news in the morning. It is the last thing we hear about when we go to bed at night, so it's quite a dramatic situation. And this geopolitical situation of the world after Russia's invasion in Ukraine, of course, has influenced science and management in the Arctic very much, and quite dramatically, I would say. Following Western sanctions against Russia as a reaction to the war in Ukraine, Norway, as other countries, paused bilateral and institutional cooperation and contact with Russia quite immediately after the invasion. And this applied to scientific organizations as well. And the Norwegian Polar Institute is an institute that was actually moved here to Tromsø as part of a geopolitical development after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, to have institutions up north that could underline and foster the dialogue between northwestern Russia in very difficult times. And therefore this sanctions, which we are now having, is affecting the work on a daily basis very much. We follow, of course, the Norwegian sanction policy. There is no bilateral dialogue anymore. There is no institutional dialogue, but there is an opening for a certain scientist-to-scientist dialogue. Last year, for instance, when the war in Ukraine came, we should celebrate nearly 30 years of cooperation on the Barents Sea ecosystem, environment, and its development, where we have had a good cooperation with Russia for many years. Of course, this 30 years anniversary was not held. It was not possible, so it's postponed. Likewise, there are many other projects that are put on a halt. There is a certain scientist-to-scientist dialogue, but there is no real interaction anymore. We have a sister institute in St. Petersburg, the Arctic and Antarctic Research Institute in St. Petersburg, about 5 times the size of the Norwegian Polar Institute. We are about 200 people. They are about 1,000. They have several stations in Antarctica. They have several vessels, icebreakers, and so on, a much larger capacity than we have. but the bilateral dialogue is not there with them anymore. The institutional dialogue is put to a halt. There is maybe some contact scientist to scientist, but that is not very much. There are projects still going on, like the Sea-Track project on the seabirds, that is seabird ecology. So some data exchange is going on, but it is very, very little. And for the good understanding of the Arctic, as it was mentioned earlier, the halt in the cooperation and the exchange of data, the exchange of information, is a problem for getting a holistic understanding of how the Arctic is developing in these times when especially we see the effect of climate change. For instance, permafrost that was recently shown on the map here. We have to have a certain dialogue to get a fully understanding how this is changing. But on the background of the sanctions and the political situation, that is of course very, very difficult. How shall we come about it? I really don't know. From a Western point of view, the war has to end before we are establishing a new contact. There has to come a peace treaty or some kind of solution in Ukraine. I don't know how long it takes. Western intelligence is not telling us anything about how long it will take either. But we need to have a solution in Ukraine before we can re-establish the dialogue. I have been working, as it was said, in fisheries for many years. And between Norway and Russia, the fisheries cooperation is more than 60 years old, and it has been functioning very well to being able to develop the fisheries in the Barents Sea in quite a sustainable way. And the stocks there are still quite sustainably be harvested. Last year, the cooperation was halted, so the data from the Russian side were lacking. And it is just a matter of a couple of years, if this continues, before this good cooperation will more or less disappear, and it will only be the Norwegian data that will be used to assess the fish stocks and give management advices. And I'm quite afraid that if this continues in the long run, it will be very detrimental to the development of our fisheries. On the other hand, I have been following this for such a long time that I know that during the Cold War, it was actually the Russians who came west. They, after a very difficult period in the 50s, they came to Bergen to start the cooperation in the late 50s. It was not the Norwegians or the Western side who waited for the Russians. It was the Russians who came to the Western side to re-establish or to establish this contact. So maybe this is something that could happen this time also. Probably they then has to be defeated on the battleground. Something like that has to be the solution this time, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ole Øvretveit. Our next speaker is with us from Italy, though her main office is in Germany. Nicole Biebow is chair of the European Polar Board since 2010. She has led the International Cooperation Unit at the Alfred Wegner Institute, Arve. Nicole is also the coordinator of the EU Polar Net, as well as being coordinator for the EU-funded Arctic Research Icebreaker Consortium. And she holds a PhD in marine geology. So, Nicole, I hope you're with us. Please, the screen is yours.
Good morning, dear colleagues. I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry not being able to be with you this. Can you hear me okay? Because I hear a lot of reflections. I have been asked to reflect in my speech on how the Russian invasion in Ukraine influences our research in the Arctic. As I'm working at the Alfred Wegner Institute in Germany, I will use our cooperation as an example.
I will call you up to to the chair. I will call you up to the chair afterwards, and then you have to do a speech.
Especially in Arctic research. We had a joint station with Russian institutes at the Samoylov station in the Lena Delta, where also our long-term permafrost observatory is located. We also had a joint laboratory, the Otto Schmidt Laboratory, at the Arctic and Antarctic Research Institute in St. Petersburg, and a joint master program for polar marine research with the St. Petersburg State University. In addition, our projects, in most of our projects, we are working together, or we have worked together with Russian researchers. That means we had a really long-term cooperation built on trust and joint understanding. This all has been shut down now, completely. So, which means that especially our Arctic research is significantly influenced. We have no communication with Russian colleagues anymore. This is related to the German rules, and data which has been gathered after the invasion to Ukraine cannot be published anymore. Also, for example, the Mosaic expedition, which I guess most of you know, would have never been possible under the current condition. This is only an example, as Russia was our main partner for logistics and exchange of personnel. The Russian support allowed to keep this expedition ongoing even when COVID started, which means that such a large-scale international initiative is at the moment, at least in the Arctic, not possible anymore. So what is the scientific community doing to overcome these problems, or at least to close some data gaps which are resulting from the inaccessible of the Russian Arctic? We are trying to overcome it on several levels. So first of all, of course, we seek new working areas. And a lot of colleagues have now started to work much more intensively in the Canadian and US Arctic. For example, on permafrost, we already had a strong cooperation with these partners, but this is even more intensified now. Of course, this does not fully solve the scientific problems, but at least it allows us to close important data gaps. We are cooperating much more intensively with the Earth observation community. That's also a reason why I'm currently here in Italy, to get at least space-based information from the Russian Arctic. We try still to keep our long-term observatories working. They are now served exclusively by our Russian colleagues, and we hope to get access to the data when the geopolitical situation improves. And that's maybe most important, we came much more closer together on a European level. We are sharing our experience, our best practices and data. To say something about what we are doing in Europe, so we have organizations that help us in the current situations a lot. One of those is the European Polar Board. I also would like to mention the EU Polar Cluster, which comprises all the EU projects funded in polar research, and last but not least, of course, EU PolarNet, which covers all European polar research organizations. And these organizations saw the problem very early, made us join forces. We had discussion sessions to identify the effects and discussed how we can overcome these effects jointly. So, for example, again, by sharing data or best practices. We did this, by the way, also for the pandemic, so not only for the invasion in Ukraine. And I can tell you that sometimes it helps the projects a lot when they learn that they are not alone with the problem. For example, Arve had 15 PhD students who could not finalize their thesis because they are relying on publication of the data they collected together with the Russians. And either they moved to another topic or they simply left science. So I have been also asked, and I would like to finalize with this to give you some personal reflection on the situation. I have coordinated a large German-Russian project in the Okhotsk Sea called Kuril Okhotsk Sea Experiments in the late 90s, early 2000s. This project made me spend half of the year in Vladivostok for about a period of 7 years. And I have to tell you that the Russian colleagues not only became friends in that time, but also some kind of family members. When I learned about the current situation, my heart really breaks, and I'm still suffering from this, because I'm sure that none of these colleagues would ever have supported such an invasion in the Ukraine. They are international and not in favor of the war. Now they are isolated again, and especially the young generation of scientists who started to become very international, who spoke excellent English and did really good scientific work, has no perspective anymore. And it's even worse, some of them might need to fight in a war. This is really a dramatic situation. But I also experienced, on the opposite side, positive effects, which I might not have had if everything would be normal. I'm currently preparing a quite huge EU proposal offering large suite of infrastructures at both poles. And as the Ukraine has excellent infrastructures in the Antarctic, they became a full partner in the consortium. And these people, which I have not known before, they are really enthusiastic, contributing very well and absolutely friendly. And even if they are working under unbelievable conditions at the moment, they still keep the Antarctic program running. The institute, the Ukrainian National Antarctic Institute, is not existing anymore. It is bombed out. And several of their scientists fight in the war. But independently of that, they want to work with us, and we should be open also to do that. I am quite sure that I would not have considered them as a partner for such a project if the war would have not brought so much attention to the Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicole, and she will be with us. So if there are any questions to her, we can she can be addressed at the end of the panel. A final introductory remarks will come from Finland's ambassador to Arctic Affairs and Finnish senior Arctic official Petteri Vuojamäki. Finland is in the process of creating a new Arctic strategy and had a session here at Arctic Frontiers to get further input. So I'm very interested in hearing your processes for your new strategy, and the floor is yours, Petteri.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ole, ladies and gentlemen. I have to say this is one of the most intimidating panels and discussions that I've ever attended. For a humble diplomat to be surrounded by so much academic wisdom, scientific knowledge, is a humbling experience, to say the least. I should say that the more I think I understand about the Arctic science, the more worried I keep getting. The global overview from October 2020, as you all know, identified 16 major global climate tipping points, 9 of which are in the Arctic and northern regions. And I think that should give us all cause for concern. These range from collapse of the Greenland ice sheet, collapse of North Atlantic deep water formation, collapse of the Arctic winter sea ice, abrupt thaw followed by collapse of the boreal permafrost, and northern expansion of the boreal forest. So there are lots of worrying developments underway. Let me make a second point, and the second point is the Arctic Council. The Arctic Council for the past 27 years, if my arithmetic works well, has been, is, and shall remain to be the primary forum for circumpolar Arctic cooperation. It has served as a high-level intergovernmental forum for political and scientific issues common to the governments in the region and to the people in the region, the Arctic residents. The Arctic Council has contributed to international climate processes such as the IPCC, has produced many groundbreaking assessments on various facets of climate change in the Arctic. The fact of the matter remains that in order for us to understand what the global climate change means, requires us understanding about the climate change in the Arctic. Now, as I say honestly that 2022 was really not the year that I wanted to have or was expecting to have an experience in Arctic cooperation. In December 2021, I returned with my colleagues from the Arctic Council senior officials meeting, which was held in Salekhard, Russian Siberia. On the plane back, I was full of excitement, optimism, and hope for the things and achievements that we could achieve during the Russian chairmanship. Black carbon and methane was mentioned in the earlier interventions. We had discussed that and set up a procedure for us to be able to agree on new higher targets. That was one of the issues that was discussed there. Now, currently, as regards the Arctic Council, the focus has to be on ensuring the orderly transfer of the chairmanship from the Russian Federation to Norway later this spring. And I say it now, and I have said it before, and I shall continue to be saying it, that if there is any country that could best steer us forward in an orderly fashion, that is Norway. And I think Norway and Norwegian efforts deserve all our support. I understand well the predicament that the scientific community has been faced following the decisions that the governments took after the continuing horrible atrocities and brutality taking place on a soil of an independent sovereign country. I'm always reminded by a good colleague, a cultural anthropologist who works at the Arctic Center at the University of Lapland, whose career has consisted of spending weeks and months on remote Arctic communities in the Russian Federation. I can just imagine his feelings in the current situation. The second point that I'd like to make is that we should not forget to listen the people that live in the Arctic, who face the climate change and its consequences firsthand every day in their lives. And I quote my good friend and colleague, President Sarah Olsvik of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, who recently said that, and I quote, "For history not to repeat itself, we have much to protect and fight for. The positive role academia and science has played before in supporting Inuit and other Arctic indigenous peoples through the generation of knowledge produced in various knowledge systems has added to our own knowledge, paving the way for collaborations that were and will always be historic milestones." That was well said from Sarah. As for Finland, there is no decision yet for us to revise the Arctic strategy. The Arctic strategy that was published in 2021 is still valid. We will need to review some sections of it, but it falls on the new government then to decide on the way forward. But I note that high-level research was one of the absolute priorities highlighted in the Finnish Arctic policy strategy, and I'm very proud of the Arctic Center in the University of Lapland, which is a flagship of the Finnish Arctic research effort, and I think they're doing an excellent job. Now, I'd also like to say I'm very conscious that President Kullerud of the U-Arctic network is looking at me, but I can't leave this podium without mentioning the U-Arctic network. Their secretariat is hosted in the University of Lapland. And despite the necessary decisions that they've taken with regard to Russian participation, their role remains extremely strong. The latest information that I received was that they have actors from 22 countries. They have 173 agencies collaborating. They have 62 thematic academic networks. And if one considers the 20 Arctic chairs, counting together the number of scientists and researchers cooperating in the network, the figure amounts to 1,000 researchers. That is an ambitious achievement, and I would encourage all to acquaint themselves, if you haven't already, on the U-Arctic and their activities. This red number is now blinking, so I conclude by citing Greta Thunberg from 2020. She said, "We cannot make it without science," and she was worried. My daughter is exactly the same age as Greta Thunberg. My daughter is extremely worried. I am worried, and we all should be worried and try to find the way to move forward and to save the planet on which we live. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Petteri. And now I'd like to invite the panel to come to the stage. Eystein Jansen, Vice President of the European Research Council, Mike Sfraga, Chair of the Arctic Research Commission, Clara Gansland, Special Envoy for Arctic Matters to the EU, and Lars Kullerud, President of Arctic, and Lise Øvreås, who has already been introduced. So please come up.
Just be careful. I'm sorry.
So we heard from experts and Arctic leaders, their interpretation and thoughts on the current situation of Arctic science diplomacy. I'd like to ask you, Eystein, in your view, what is the Arctic? What is the status of Arctic science and science diplomacy and science collaboration today?
Well, I think we could just listen to the tone of the introductory talks that it's quite bleak, and there are good reasons for not being too optimistic, and any re-emergence of science diplomacy will need to take time to get back to the level where it was, because it is a success story. Science collaboration has been very important for keeping the Arctic as a low tension area until now. But I think, I don't think anybody knows how it will develop. And if anything, we know is that it will take time, especially if we need to re-engage Russia. But of course there are things we should do and should continue to do, but maybe I can come back to that later in the discussion.
Yeah. Mike, how about the American science, Arctic science community? How are they affected by the current situation?
The same way as other countries have been. We sort of are mourning a loss. It's personal loss, it's colleagues, but the challenges that we all face, whether it's environment or the broad list of challenges and opportunities, require research. It requires informed decision making. And so we're the same as other countries. The institutions to institutions, the government to government relations, all of that is gone. There's some researcher to researcher dialogue, but that's very careful. It's very sparse and careful, because we have colleagues in Russia and we don't know. We just don't know what the dynamics are really internal to Russia. But we're concerned. We have been asked by the globe to provide a better picture of the single large existential threat, which is climate change. We have not, I think we've gone past the phrase of climate change. I think we're sort of at global heating here in the Arctic. But we have 50% of the Arctic that we don't have good data from. It wasn't fantastic beforehand. It was always a challenge. But now we don't have any. And we're trying to put together a puzzle, but we only have 50% of the puzzle pieces. So we really cannot provide a better understanding of the North, in this case, which informs all sorts of policy. So I think we are just like our colleagues, which, in conclusion, which then enables, motivates US researchers to reach out to colleagues, not just across the North, but across the world, non-Arctic states as well, to ensure that we're doing the very best we can to gather the data and leverage the expertise that we actually have access to, and we can actually interpret as best as possible with the colleagues we actually have access to.
Lise, you mentioned the methane picture, and can you elaborate a bit on what the consequences of the loss of these Russian data, terrestrial data especially, are on putting puzzling the picture together on climate research, as Mike was saying?
Well, I'm supporting very much what Mike was saying, and my point is that this is this kind of new data. There's new data, so because it's popping up a lot of methane, natural gases, and they're biogenic, and we didn't know that before. So it's a lot of biology-driven research that there is new area, and a lot of the Russian scientists was super good in this field. So some of my very good collaborators, which I used to have dialogue with, they don't respond to my emails anymore. So I can't send them my cultures, my bugs that I have been growing in the lab to try to study them more in details, and I can't get the feedback from them, which is because they really are the expert in the field. And of course we can build up, and of course we're joining forces with other international collaborators, but there is a know-how, and also the access to the systems, because the permafrost in Svalbard is different from the Canadian Arctic and also the Russian Arctic. So we really are lacking a whole piece of the puzzle, which is kind of frustrating, because we had started. It was often a challenge to go and get samples from the Russian and also bits of the data, but at least it was some mechanisms. We had some collaborations and something that worked, and now the doors are very much closed, and we see that we're losing very important bricks in this whole picture.
Some of the experts I'm talking to say that it's not that big of a problem, because we have so good satellite monitoring of the region now that will cover for, if not all, then at least sufficient parts of it.
That bits and pieces of it, but you really need to, if you really need to go down in the details and understand the mechanism, which is important now if we're going to do something, because we know the climate change, right? We know these things, but if we're going to go and understand why it's there and what's happening, we need to go further, and we need the data set.
Right. Lars, you are at the center of one of the largest science collaboration organizations in the Arctic. How is the war affecting collaboration among your member organizations, and how do you as an organization handle it? You have also many Russian member institutions.
Yeah, UArctic has already got a very nice presentation of what we are, has 173 members plus 55 members in Russia. We had to then, in a way, pause the membership of our Russian members as of beginning of last year, And it looks like that have to continue. It is absolutely a harmful thing, and we all discussed why. We want cooperation, and we cannot. So it has big effects. So science diplomacy is maybe a way to produce a channel that enable relationship that can be used by the global affairs, the diplomats to build relationship in complicated times, as it was done during Cold War. Science diplomacy is also a necessity, as we discussed, because we just need that data to save the world. And that's a kind of a purpose which is beyond, in a way, beyond even mankind as we know it. So it is a bit dangerous to let current day's problem overrule that. On the other hand, there is always a risk that we as a science community get used by political systems for some kind of purpose. So we have to, as science community, understand those three kind of dimensions when we have attitudes and choose politics around these things. It's an interesting observation that in UArctic, out of the 55 Russian members, it was a big opera in the West because of Russian Rector signed this letter in support of the war. It was only 17 of the 55 who signed that letter. But we excluded them all. Still, we handled equal. Is that smart? Probably, but that's how it happens. Then, when we had the invasion of Crimea, which we almost forgotten, at that same time, UArctic got many new Chinese members. Now, with this war, India has also issued its Arctic strategy. We are getting members from India. There is a geopolitical thing happening out there, which we see points back to science, because anyone who wants to go into the Arctic domain want to use the science academic world as a tool to get a footstep in the door. So we get also used, not necessarily that is not necessarily bad, but we need to understand that's happening. So we have a kind of an interesting thing happening here, while we at the same time really need to solve the climate problem. We cannot solve the issue, particularly to understand the process you talk about, and also the northward moving of the boreal forest, a similar kind of system, which is primarily in Russia, but also North America. And without that, we are potentially doomed. The paper that came out last fall about 16 tipping points that threaten the climate system of the world, out of the 16, 12 had to do with cold places on Earth, ice, snow, cold waters, or northern forests. And the permafrost and the boreal forest we cannot solve alone without Russia, at least. Some of the others too, but we just need to be on the land there and have the scientists there with us, as you just pointed out. So we need to find a way forward, and we should remind ourselves that we have never been as detached from relationship to Russian scientists, even during the Cold War, as we are now. So the regime we have in the West towards scientific cooperation now, we never were like that in 1950s or 60s. There were more cooperation then than it is now. And finally, the Western countries do not have the same rules. Some countries have, as Nicole mentioned, she's not even allowed to talk to her scientist. You're allowed to send an email to your Russian colleague, even if they don't respond. I can talk to Russian scientists. But my colleague in in Sweden or Finland cannot. Yeah. So we are not handling this the same way.
Can you elaborate a bit on that? What can the effects be on?
No, it's not necessarily dramatic. It is like in UArctic, we now have this message we give to all the scientists that please, we encourage cooperation scientists, but at the same time we ask scientists to have respect. You cannot force your Russian colleague to answer you, because she may have reason not to answer you. To protect herself, for example. We cannot force a Finnish university professor Øvretveit pointed to. He cannot now, he's not allowed to talk to his Russian friends and colleagues, while the Norwegian scientists are allowed. And we cannot then force the Finn to do something he's not allowed to. And we cannot expect them to do that. So it's just it's very down-to-earth practical issues in how we behave. So we need to respect that we live under different conditions, all of us.
I'd just like also to hear your thoughts on what the effects of these, Nicole, these personal relationships, between Russian scientists and Western scientists, eroding. What will be the long-term effects of this be?
The big sad thing, if this lasts, and it looks like it will last for 5 or 10 years. I mean, all wars ends one day, luckily, but we don't know when. And if we get 10 years without students and young researchers meeting each other, we have to start all over. The old people, like some of us, we can maybe in 10 years still find back our old colleagues and start something. If it takes more than 10 years, then everything has to start from scratch. And it will be a deeper start than we had in 1990, because then there existed relationship, like Ole Arve mentioned, fisheries relationships. We had the Polar Bear Agreement, we had the Sami Council, we had the ISCO started before Arctic Council. We have UArctic, the route of UArctic started in 1807. So we have a long history of relationships then, and we cannot tolerate more than 5 or 10 years before that is dead, I think.
From an American perspective, Mike, do you have any thoughts and comments on that?
Yeah, same as Lars. I mean, I'm kind of pessimistic on that point. I think we've lost. Look, if the war stopped tomorrow, miraculously, things just don't turn back on. We're talking about, reconstruction, a regime of some sort in Russia. So if the war stops, the leadership of Russia perhaps does not. And what does that look like? And so this is going to take years. And then what's the fallout from all of this? What about the humanitarian side and the possible war crimes? And I mean, the layers upon layers of this, I think, will take us many, many years to work through. And the degradation that Lars is talking about, researcher to researcher, we might be in the same position 5 years from now, talking about sometime in the future when we can re-engage with Russian colleagues, and they're yearning to re-engage with the West. So I think this is, I don't want to say it's generational, but I think it's sort of a tectonic shift here that we need to be thinking about, not just 6 months from now, Mike's opinion, or a year from now. I think we need to be thinking on the 5, 10, 15 years. But think about that 10-year-old who's in elementary school, what 15 years means to that young woman who has 15 years from the age of 10, and where are they going to be? And they will not have access, perhaps, when they're at the university, to not just Russian researchers, but what does that fundamentally do to the research engine? How is this going to change research globally? So we might be talking about the Arctic here, but I'm starting to think about how does this reverberate around the globe? Because we're all thinking about shifting engagements, relationships, partnerships, cooperation, that I'm starting to see ripple beyond the Arctic.
Yeah. Clara, I'd like to bring you into this discussion also and to hear your thoughts on the issue about the consequences on science collaboration, the consequences of policies made on science collaboration, both like institutional but also personal.
No, thank you for that. Following the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February, the European Union suspended since March last year all bilateral engagement with Russian public bodies, including state universities and research facilities. And this means that we have suspended all bilateral scientific cooperation with Russian public bodies and excluded Russian state partners, including universities, from our Horizon Europe program and projects. But I'd like to also remind that these are not Arctic-specific measures, but the general principles that were decided by all EU member states regarding our bilateral relations with Russia and Belarus. I mean, we acknowledge that in the field of Arctic observations or permafrost study, that this obviously has had an effect on data collection and research efforts. And under current circumstances, we need therefore to continue and reinforce cooperation with like-minded countries, as has been discussed also previously here, and to make up for this data gap resulting from the suspension of the scientific cooperation with Russia. We have at the same time left some door open for people-to-people contacts through the EU mobility schemes for individual students and researchers. It's evident that the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine and the reaction by the European Union and its partners has affected Arctic science by losing access to Russian research facilities and data, as has been very amply explained here. But it is vital to us that we stick to our values and principles, which include also academic freedom and research integrity. This said, it's necessary to keep some activities, and there is still cooperation in some multilateral research infrastructures, such as the International Space Station and the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor. Now, we are in an unprecedented situation regarding scientific collaboration, and as I said before, we also think that it's very important to step up cooperation with like-minded countries. And if I should look ahead a little bit and point to some paths, I'd like to highlight the All-Atlantic Ocean Research and Innovation Alliance as an example of diplomatic and international cooperation. So a success story of ocean science diplomacy. Thanks to this initiative, Atlantic partners will join forces to tackle the most pressing challenges. And finally, just to recall that the European Union has invested in more than 40 projects with over 250 million euros to promote cooperation between European and international scientists from around the Atlantic. So I'll stop here, but I think that the way ahead will be to look at these other possibilities that we have and step up in those areas. Yeah. Thank you.
I'd like to also ask a follow-up question. The EU has had a quite firm and hard strategy on banning collaboration with the Russian actors and not participate where also Russian scientists and actors are present. But the EU and Russia are parties in the Central Ocean, Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement and have participated in meetings after the invasion. Does this show that the EU is more flexible on certain areas than others?
What I'd like to say there is indeed, yes, it's correct. Here, I think that this agreement is one of the key points in the EU's Arctic policy that was touched upon earlier. And the proper implementation of this agreement is a key priority for us. And we have continued, and as we can continue in certain multilateral settings, we have continued this work. So we don't believe that it would be actually in the interest to stop that work. And also we are legally bound to continue it.
Thank you. Eystein, you had a comment.
Yeah, it's sort of a follow-up to what Clara said. As we know, the Arctic systems are under transformation, and they go into uncharted territories and unpredictable or unprecedented ways. One example, we published a few years ago a paper warning about the continuation of the Atlantification of the Eurasian Arctic, what that would mean to possibly entering into a completely new Arctic Ocean. The observations we need to follow that up are primarily in Russian waters. So it's clear that we are left with a problem there. We need the observations to clarify what will happen and how fast things are happening. That said, I very much subscribe to what Clara said, but we need to explore any way we can to get information, data, and to use those collaborations that exist. And of course, all tensions in the Arctic between nations are not only concerning Russia. There are other political aspects of how we govern Arctic that needs science diplomacy and joint understanding as a basis. And I would also point out the importance of the EU programs in that aspect, that involves many of the countries, the Arctic countries, but also non-Arctic countries in the EU. And you, Lars, pointed out that there is an increased willingness on big Asian countries who are observers in the Arctic Council to be more active in Arctic research. And of course, it would be stupid of us not to include their scientists in the networks, and maybe they have access to data that we don't. So I think we should use a very broad approach and explore any possibilities for multilateral scientific collaboration that can be done under these circumstances.
Right. Mike, there are still collaboration going on in the Arctic where Russia is also included. Nuclear waste is mentioned, oil spill search and rescue, and the Russian-Norwegian fisheries agreement. Could it not be argued that the collaboration on climate is as, if not more, important than these, and more important even than the war itself, as loss of climate data can have global, much longer-term consequences?
So your comment is the argument that's happening not just behind closed doors within the scientific community, but outside of doors as well. This internal debate that perhaps is not internal anymore among the scientific community that feels as if, I mean, I have colleagues here who actually participated, feels as if we came off, at least I did, an emotional high, seeing what could be done, and the emotional high came from Mosaic. That all of these countries together, that to me was a peek into what could be at the right time. I mean, now more than ever, we needed a mosaic. We need mosaics. And so that requires the global community and the central role Russia played in that. But mosaic, the data coming out of that will help us not only understand, but it will inform decision-making way into the future. And now we're here. We don't have mosaics anymore, but we're still up against this titan of environmental change and climate change. So you could make that argument, but that argument of this large existential threat that involves the entire planet is up against a brutal ground war in Europe. It's competing against humanity's darker sides. You know, I don't want to be too doom and gloom here, but these are the discussions that I'm having with colleagues. How do we balance this? How do we not signal that it's okay to engage in a portfolio of issues that are of consequence to all of us without ignoring what's happened here? I mean, this has broken all, sort of international norms, international rule of law, systems we've built up over decades. So this is a good debate to have, and I'm not sure I have the answer to that, because some days I wake up and think, we have got to get at this. I mean, we have to for my children, for generations, we've got to have a better understanding, better access, more information, data-driven decision-making. And then I turn the television on and think, is that right? So I don't have that answer, but it's in there somewhere, and I just don't know where that is. But your question, and my attempt to answer your question, is what my colleagues here are all struggling with. How do you not normalize, but then how do we do the work? It's a conflict within.
Yeah. Lars, do you have the answer?
No, well, yes. In Soviet invaded Czechoslovakia. Weeks after, Norwegian scientists and experts went to the Soviet Union to learn about reindeer herding. And that was a brutal war, just more successful than what Russia tried to do now, because now they get opposition and is still in a war. The plan was to do something similar. They failed. So those days, during the Cold War days, we somehow had a different norm on this problem than we have for Europe today. And we haven't applied that in other similar conflicts worldwide. But maybe it's good that we show a point. So I'm not arguing that. But it is a fundamental dilemma, the one Mike pointed out. But there is also another fundamental dilemma, and that is the root problem that is discussed around in the science community, that scientific freedom, it was just mentioned, we in the Western countries supposed to represent the freedom of speech, the freedom of thought, the freedom of exchange of ideas. That's our root values. And now, ironically enough, because of that, we let somebody burn a book in Sweden, and by that they cannot join NATO. At the same time, Swedish scientists are not even allowed to talk to a scientist in Russia by Sweden, who is in favor of freedom of speech. And the same applies, of course, to other Western countries. The point is not to hang Sweden here, but showing how we are, the norms we put up and the standards we put up certainly have changed because the war is close to us. And maybe it's smart to do that now, but it cannot last forever. So we need to find solutions on the way here, and it will be brutal and will be hard. But it is, as Mike said, it's a very moral, fundamental problem where principles we stand for are very different. And sister organizations of mine, UArctic, we have now said we can cooperate on the person, but not the institution level. IASC, the International Arctic Science Committee, is a membership organization that includes Russia still. The UN bodies, we cooperate with Russia still. In Arctic Economic Council, created by the Arctic Council, there is still Russia on board. So in a way, UArctic has taken a bit more rough relationship to Russia than many of the other organizations we have for the Arctic. So it isn't so that we have one standard all the way through. We need to find somewhere is that borderline, no matter what we do.
Thank you. I'd just like a quick follow-up on that.
You're going to press for an answer, aren't you?
Yeah, no. You got to try harder, Mike. I'm sorry. No, I'd just like to follow up on the different institutional approaches and the institutional designs. Arctic Council has been working so well for 27 years. Yeah, 27 years, because it's flexibility. Mm-hmm. Now we see it shut down or put on ice, while other institutions, as you mentioned, Lars, the UN system is still functioning. Has this flexibility become a double-edged sword where we now see the other edge?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that, well, when the Arctic Council was created, it was created on some assumptions, some international rules-based order. It was created, in agreement that all 8 nations would abide by certain norms. And I think, obviously the Arctic Council decided that this went beyond the pale of it all. I think you're right. There's flexibility with the Arctic Council, a very novel organization with novel participation and open to members, observers, and everyone here knows. I might argue the other side of this, that the flexibility has enabled the Arctic Council to pause for a moment, which it did, and then consider where they are in terms of the war on Ukraine, and then start up, slowly, but start up the working groups again. Yes, with the omission of Russia, but the flexibility within the organization, I think it's weathered the storm. You know, the storm's not over. I mean, the sails are kind of ripped and they're still navigating a big gale force wind out there. But I think that it has been able to recollect itself and think about the ways in which it can move forward. So perhaps that flexibility has allowed the Arctic Council to draw back, think about how it is they can conduct the business on our collective behalf, and do so in light of what we're all faced with, which is how do you do what you do in light of, you know, something that no one had predicted before. So I'm not sure it was naive to think that the structure being flexible was detrimental to it. I think it was set up on the basis of some assumptions, you know, almost 3 decades ago, and perhaps that flexibility has allowed it to endure to the place it is today. And now with a Norwegian chairship, as noted, we have high confidence in Norway's ability to not just navigate but to advance. You know, maybe they're doing absolutely the best they can because of the flexibility within the body.
Thank you. Lars mentioned also India and China becoming more and more active on the Arctic stage. There has been, India is not a part of the sanction regime against Russia. It's getting new or much more energy resources from Russia. And of course, China is also moving in both to closer relation, working closer with Russia, and is moving into the Arctic. And I believe the Russian Arctic ambassador said in Iceland at Arctic Circle that there is no Arctic without Russia. If this continues for a prolonged time, and we see the Arctic 7, Western 7 countries forming new and tighter collaborations among them, and then you have a more Eastern Arctic. Can we see the Arctic looking decades into the future as a divided part of the world, like an Oriental and a Western Arctic? Eystein, I would like to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, that may be an option politically, but it's also an option for science diplomacy to bridge and to contract that division. So here I see a role for science diplomacy, and it will be important to engage with the Chinese, Indian, and other Asian actors to prevent that, so that scientific collaboration doesn't end up completely divided. But politically, that may be how it works, but there is a role for science diplomacy there.
Clara, do you have a quick comment on this scenario that's more like long-term grim effects of the embargo?
As I said before, I think that the important now, as was also said here by my neighbor, is to look for cooperation opportunities and the role for science diplomacy further on to build bridges. I think, as I mentioned, this All-Atlantic Ocean Research and Innovation Alliance, for instance, is an example in another part, but still a very comprehensive cooperation, because there, for instance, we have partners from both sides of the Atlantic: US, Canada, Argentina, Brazil, Cape Verde, South Africa. So it shows that when there are common interests, it's possible to work together.
Last, a short comment.
Yeah, I would maybe make one stretch further, inspired by Mike's comment, I think. I think it's a misunderstanding to think that our job now will be to recreate the early 2000s Arctic cooperation for the future. It will never happen. The present day, Asia is much bigger economic power than US and Europe together soon. That means the world is totally different in the future than it has been. Now EU do this brave job to make its energy system independent on oil and gas. We will get totally different challenges in the Arctic as a resource pool for that supply chain. And we do need to do research around that. And that change totally the economics of the world. And maybe the future powers and research partners we need is of course Russia because of territory, but it's primarily Asia and building the knowledge pool and keep resource knowledge. And we solve the climate problems globally in India and China, not in the Arctic only.
Lisa, final question from me before I open for one question on overtime from the audience. The Arctic collaboration, is it frozen or broken?
I think to echo Lars, it's difficult to go back. It needs to be something new. We're building up something new. So frozen and maybe, but it will be something completely different.
But you know, ice is brittle, so.
Exciting times. If anybody has one short question, yes?
Shout.
The mic is coming here.
Thank you. Great. David Truckman. I mean, great presentations. Very quickly, just picking up on Mike's missing jigsaw pieces. Is the risk here, I'm thinking in policy terms, leaving aside that science always wants a nice long time series of data, and there are human relations affected in this rupture, but in policy terms, hard-nosed policy terms, is the risk that we're going to miss something? I'm thinking of your discoveries in Svalbard with these sudden, stunning methane releases. Are we going to, because of missing 50% of the jigsaw pieces, are we actually going to miss a tipping point? Not just approaching a tipping point, but passing a tipping point. That's a question for any of you.
Yeah, we're going to miss these data. It will be difficult to fill the gaps. Yeah.
I think we also will miss solutions.
Yeah.
One is the data, knowledge, insight, but also creative solutions, because many climate solutions probably need to happen in Siberia.
Right. On that note, I will ask you to give this panel a hand, an applause, and thank you all for coming, and have a great last day of Arctic Frontiers 2023. Thank you.